Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and this radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you each Sunday and gives you, our listeners, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. And you can also visit the Center for Black Literature website at www.centerforblackLiterature.org, where we have YouTube presentations on the interviews we've done with our writers. I'm so pleased to have with me today one of the writers who is a participant in our National Black Writers Conference, and she has also participated in previous conferences. The writer and creative artist and activist, Emily Raboteau. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greene. I'm really pleased to be here.
Okay, so just to give our listeners an opportunity to hear about Emily Raboteau, she teaches at what's called the intersection of social and environmental justice, race, climate change, and parenthood. Her previous books are Searching for Zion, which I loved, which was a winner of the American Book Award and a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and also her debut novel, The Professor's Daughter. Raboteau is a contributing editor at Orion and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. Her essays have been in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York, the Nation, and elsewhere. And she is also at one of our sister institutions. She's a professor of creative writing at City College. And we are going to be discussing her latest book, which is a wonderful memoir. Emily always has always combined the personal and the political. Lessons for Survival, Mothering Against the Apocalypse. And I encourage you to go out and purchase. It's just recently come out. So we are going to begin by having you talk about what motivated you to write this book, which, as I read it, I was taking notes. I said it's really your personal story. It's a meditation on the impact of environmental racism, of racial justice. It's an illustration of how the environment impacts us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it really gives so many instances of how we have been living with the impact of environmental climate change for years. And some of us have internalized it. So it's become sort of, like a normal way of life, but that should not be normal. And I said, there are many gems in this book. It's a lens and a guidance for moving forward. So let's begin. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, first, thanks for that high praise and for reading it with such care. So this book grew out of a series of essays I've been writing over the course of the last decade since becoming a parent. My sons are now 11 and 12 years old, and one of the first essays that I wrote about social justice that found its way into this book was originally in another book called The Fire This Time. And that was edited by Jesmyn Ward,
Yes.
who I think it was after Trayvon Martin's death.
Mhm.
She was feeling in such despair and also rage that she understood she needed to move through those feelings in the company of others. That was a lesson to me, actually, that she wanted to create an anthology with other Black writers whom she admired, who she understood were writing about race in the tradition. And so she said she wanted to gather those voices around her the way she would want to gather those voices around her at a dinner table. And that's to her what that anthology reflected, community working through an issue affecting us. When she invited me to write for that anthology, I thought, because the title was a nod to James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, that I might undertake writing an essay for it that would be kind of like what Baldwin did for his nephew in writing a letter,
Yes.
uh, about what to expect. I thought maybe I'll write a letter to my Black sons, but at the time, Jasmine extended that invitation to me and other writers, including Mitchell Jackson and Wendy Walters, Garnet Cadogan, Kiesi Lehman, and several others. My children were only 2 and 4 years old, and so I thought, I don't think I'm yet equipped with the language to know what to say to them about how to protect themselves yet from state sanctioned violence, including coming from the police, even though we live in a neighborhood that's plagued by police brutality. This was something their father and I were talking about. When is the right time to begin talking to our children? Like, when do we
Yes.
need to give our sons the talk,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then as I was in a state of confusion about what to write for Jesmond, as well as a state of confusion about what to say to my own children and when, I encountered a mural in our neighborhood, Washington Heights, in Upper Manhattan, that was part of a series of murals. I didn't know it at the time, called Know Your Rights. And they were specifically created for the community, to talk about and think about this issue. Um, so I photographed that mural, and then I visited all the other murals in New York City, and they were sited in neighborhoods like ours around the city, that were dealing with police brutality. And so that gave me a structure, an operating structure that was visual and that was also about mapping the city. And that became a pattern for me. Um, I later wrote, about bird murals in my neighborhood that were part of another series called the Audubon Mural Project. And those are beautiful murals all around Washington Heights and Harlem, in the area where John James Audubon lived and where he's buried, that reflect on birds that are expected to be extinct by the year 2080 if we continue on our current climate trajectories. But because they're also appearing in a neighborhood that's plagued by environmental justice, frontline community, of course, in Black and brown neighborhoods is where they place poisoning infrastructure, right?
Yes.
Which is why kids like ours have higher rates of asthma, and adverse health outcomes. So, I began kind of making ties between social and environmental justice because of these public art projects. And then the third one I'll mention, because there's this sort of a triptych in this book, Lessons for Survival, of essays that are looking at public art projects. The third one was a series of signs placed also around the city, much like the Know Your Rights murals and the Audubon mural project, about the effects of climate change upon New York City, not in some future, but right now.
Yes.
This flashing. These were not murals, but signs that were like road signs placed in odd places, not on the road, but like in a public park,
Right.
flashing very alarming messages. And for example, 50 million climate refugees, things that are alerting us to the patterns of movement. And I was very alarmed to see a sign again in my neighborhood, visited the other signs, reckoned with what the artist was trying to say, and tried to do that in community, which is something I learned from Jesmond Ward. Like, these are tough issues we kind of can't face alone. We need to do it. We need to do it with our families and in community.
Right.
Something I tried to practice and demonstrate in this book.
Yes. I think the book, I said there are many important gems, but so often we move through the city, we move through our environment, and we do not pay attention,
Mm.
because I was not aware the whole concept of the Audubon, what James Audubon did, and the murals. I don't think I would have necessarily paid attention, but it forced me to think about the environment. I even find now when I'm going outside, I'm finding that I'm looking at things more carefully.
Mm.
And you documented that so well, that whole concept of climate refugees. That is so perfect. I think if people could understand what we mean when we say climate refugees, they would get it, as to what is happening. And you don't only do this in New York City, you go outside of the city and talk about the impact of this in our country, Alaska, in Palestine. You
Mm.
really are documenting that in so many ways. So you wrote this book relatively quickly. If you didn't start you, until you began writing Jasmine, the essays for Jasmine Ward.
Mhm.
Yeah. So going back to, there's some highlights and some major findings. What did you find is really something that we should be aware of as you crafted this book? What are some major findings?
One major finding for me, you brought up the term climate refugee, which is a scary term, but actually, that term was first used in a major way in the media after Hurricane Katrina, when there was this sort of diaspora that happened with largely, Black residents of places that were the ground zero of that event, New Orleans and its environs. Um, My father comes from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, which was a ground zero of that event, and our people really scattered after that. Some of them moved to Atlanta, some of them moved to Houston. Um, Not exactly a safe place to move to if we're still talking about
That's right.
climate change, right? but but my point is, people who'd been living for generations in a place um, that was so affected by climate change had to move. And uh I don't think I've fully put together, even though this affected my very family, that this was, climate refugees are existing in our own families and in our own nation, right? It's not something that's happening only in the global south, or right. People are moving and um going to have to be thinking about moving soon. And already, one of the people I interviewed for this book, I'd made a portrait of her. Um, she's become a friend of mine, is a woman who lives in a van that she
Yes,
named.
that was so interesting. Who would have thought that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
She,
but she's thinking ahead and she's saying this is how I'm dealing with it. I'm sorry. I continue with that story.
yes, she's living what she calls the van life. Think big, live small. That's her kind of tagline. And I think it's just delightful that she named her van that she lives in after Langston Hughes. Her van's name is Langston Langston Hughes.
Yeah.
But she lost her home to Hurricane Katrina. Sorry, not Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy.
Andy, yes. But she was in
Yeah,
Staten Island, I
she
believe,
was
right?
in Staten Island.
Yeah.
That's right. And unlike some homeowners who lost their homes, she didn't own her home. She rented a basement apartment in somebody else's home, and she lost all of her possessions. And she was so shook by that experience that she decided she didn't ever want to be at risk like that again. And she completely revolutionized her life. She decided things don't matter, experience matters, nature matters. So she often will park her van. She has the gift of mobility and freedom, and she parks her van in nature parks and preserves. She stays in campsites, and she thinks really deliberately about her footprint. She has to get rid of her own waste, the trash that she produces and the waste from her own body. She has to purchase her own water. And so she has a very different way of thinking about her impact on the landscape. Um, and her values are very different from what they were. They're no longer attached to capital in the same way. So I really admire the choices she's made, even though some people would look at her and describe her as homeless.
Yes. And when I referenced the climate refugees, I thought about those people who we do describe as homeless. And then people forget why so many people are coming to this country. So much of it is a result of climate change.
Right.
Africa, in South America, in the
Mm.
Caribbean, they are running to try
Central.
and get safe spaces
Yeah.
and shelter for.
Yes, I'm so glad you
Yes,
mentioned that, and I'm not sure it's a big enough part of the conversation. We're
yes,
having here in the city, we're having a migration crisis, and there's not enough room ostensibly for all the people that are coming to New York. And we're seeing these mothers with their children on the subway trains trying to make it by selling candy.
yes,
But behind a lot of those stories is, they're coming from places that have tipped into violence or poverty because they are not able to grow food anymore, for
yes.
example,
Escaping the desert.
escaping the desert.
Yes, or, or torrential flooding. Yeah.
Yeah, unlivable climates. Mhm.
Yes, yes. So that was one major gem. I want to go back to your children. What has it been like to raise two Black boys in this environment? What were the highlights? What are the messages that you got from that?
Well, first I want to highlight joy because even though we're talking about some dark elements and this book is taking on some challenging themes, we're living in an era of polycrisis. It's been described as polycrisis. We've moved through this pandemic. We're talking about the climate emergency. Um, we're talking about threats to Black life that aren't new but still here. And some of these crises we were prepared for by our own parents. Other crises we were not because our parents didn't go through them. So it feels like, in one sense, a new era of parenting. And in another sense, those of us who come from historically resilient communities and who have ancestors who've persisted and thrived through existential threats in the past have a lot of wisdom and lessons about survival. So, I also just want to say, of course, having children, um, it's delightful. It's it's joyful. Their questions about the world and their investigations and their discoveries are also like my own, and that's true for so many of us who are parenting in these times, which so often feel dark, is that it can feel like a second childhood to be raising children and to fall in love with the world again and again and to understand why it is we need to protect and save it is so that our children can
Right.
and
But
can
yeah,
have futures.
I'm glad you referenced joy because our children, as you said, are a reminder of why we have to have hope and we have to give them hope and we
Yes.
have to talk about the ways forward. And you've cited some instances where your children are actually doing that because of the questions they're raising and the projects that they're working on. As I read it, I thought about Octavia Butler, of course. Her court. This is a cautionary tale. This is another cautionary tale
Hmm.
as to what you're doing. So I think what you've done is what many writers do. They take what is personal, what affects them personally, what they see in their community, and again, you stress the importance of community, which we
Hmm.
can never forget, and they make it political.
Hmm.
So how just talk a little bit more about how you have made the personal political.
One example I'll give, and thank you for mentioning Octavia Butler. I mean, she was just so prescient. She foresaw in Parable of the Sower, which takes place in 2024, by the way.
Yeah, I forgot that. Oh my
We're
goodness.
here and
You're
we're
living it.
we're
Yes.
living through the fires that she foresaw. We're living through, we've experienced the president who trying to make America great again. She even used that terminology. And she was just wise, sagacious enough to look at current events and kind of forecast what was coming, right? So I think about her a lot, looking at what reality is and trying to think ahead. Um, and one, I'll give an example of one thing I did in this book. I uh, I learned from a climate scientist named Dr. Catherine Hayhoe that one of the best things we can do to combat climate change in our daily lives is simply to talk about it. And that's because there's a relatively wide distance between the number of us who are appropriately alarmed, right? Who, first of all, who believe in it. Second of all, who are um, scared, which is an okay feeling to feel about it. Um, and the number of us who talk about it with any degree of regularity, if at all. So that gap is something that's known as climate silence, and this scientist was encouraging us to try to close that gap. So I undertook that piece of advice seriously for an entire year, the year 2019, the pre-pandemic year. I I decided that I was going to make a New Year's resolution of talking about it every day among family and friends, that I would ask people in my community, kind of in the way Jasmine asked her community, right? Like, how are you doing with this? What are you thinking about this? How do you feel the effects of this in your body and in your landscape? Like, what can you tell me? What are our lessons? What are how are we going to move through this together? And what I found was people were very eager to talk about it. And I wrote down their answers pretty much every day for a year. And one of the chapters in this book is a rather lengthy, what I would call maybe a climate diary or a global chorus, right? Those are voices from students at City College. This being a global city, their voices from people who are often immigrants from other places, and also people from my social network who don't live in the United States, but in other countries. So it gives a kind of a sample of world voices. And what I found doing that exercise was that a lot of the voices were echoing each other. For example, somebody in Lebanon, somebody in Australia, and somebody in the Bay Area in California were all using the same kind of language of fear about smoke inhalation and wildfires, particularly as they were affecting their children, the lungs of their children. And so we began to see it began to make the world feel smaller in that we're all in this together now. We're all facing threat. It doesn't look the same everywhere, and depending on our class, and the
Yes,
nation we live in, right? But this is no longer something we can not talk about or ignore.
right. I think those are really excellent examples of how you made the personal political. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking, I'm in your diary, I'm in your journal, because I could see where you would talk about something and then reference it. It was referenced from another space. So we were getting a record of what you do in your journal, also
Mhm.
of your journaling experience. Talk a little bit about some of the other examples you saw outside of New York. As you
Mhm.
traveled to Alaska, you traveled to Palestine, you talk about Flint, Michigan. Just highlight some of the issues that came up there as we kind of bring this to a close.
Sure. Two of the major essays in this book take place outside New York, as you mentioned, one of them in Palestine. I was invited with a number of other writers around the time of the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, just to write about the occupation, to witness violence happening in Palestine. And I wrote, this is probably my first explicit piece of environmental writing, was about inequitable access to clean water and
Yes.
to electricity in the West Bank. I wasn't in Gaza, I was in the West Bank, and things were just so bad there. I mean, um, inevitably, it became an essay that was about settler colonialism, and the threats posed to Arabs who live in the area of the West Bank that I was studying. And where that seemed to be most um, one of the areas it seemed to be most explicit was just in the inequitable access to literal power, right? And to clean water, which we all need to. And at the same time that I was there, it was during the Flint water crisis. And Muhammad Ali had just died. Um, and he was one of our first people in our country to be, an advocate for Palestine. So I was really thinking hard about some of the ties between Black life and Palestinian life when I was there. And I also went to coastal Alaska. I was in the Arctic, and I had the opportunity to interview elders from the Yupik indigenous community there about changes they've seen to the landscape in their lifetime. So these are octogenarians who remember the time before the warming began and live also in ground zero of the climate crisis. So could really say, within one human lifetime, we've seen um, such violence enacted upon the landscape. And it tried to make connections again between colonialism and climate change, vis-a-vis the lives of these elders. And I'll just finish by saying one of the lessons I was given by an elder there when I asked him, "What do you do with your anger?" And this was a man who had been through a lot, who had been taken as a child from his community and sent to one of these state schools where they try to beat the Indian out of the child, where they try to rob you of your language and of your hair and of your legacy and of your community. What do you do with your anger? And he said, we take care of each other.
I love it. Yes. That's a good message to bring this to a close. And that's a good message as someone who is teaching at City College. And as you said, working with a vast and diverse group of students. What is the message that you have to our students?
I think we're living in a time where we're being called to practice nurture and care and kinship with each other and with the non-human world. Um, Saidiya Hartman has said, care is the antidote to violence. I keep thinking about that and trying to practice it and demonstrate it for my students and think through that with them, what that really means.
Well, thank you. Just share with our audience the title of your book, how they can get it. Okay.
Yes, here it is. I don't know if it looks backwards on the
Oh, it
screen.
looks wonderful. Looks much
Okay.
better than mine because I don't have the color. I do have
Yes,
the color. I don't have the hard copy.
it's Lessons for Survival, Mothering Against the Apocalypse, and it's in bookstores now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, for writing this book, for being another cautious storyteller, because we need that in order to move forward. You have been listening to my interview with Emily Raboteau, and this is Writers on Writing. This radio show is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Remember to come back next week. Support the 17th National Black Writers Conference and write us at info@centerforblackLiterature.org. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. Thank you.